Okay, so slightly later than built, we're going to have Becky Bellinger and Ryan Brady talking us through gamification. And uh, we're recording, and please use the chat for any discussion throughout. Otherwise, I'll hand it over to you guys.
Cool. So yeah, really sorry about that. I have no idea what happened. The slight panic. Okay, cool. So yeah, as Stuart just said, we're going to be talking to you about gamification as an innovative teaching method. And just to introduce who we are, I'm Rebecca Bellinger, and I'm a teaching fellow in film production over in the Alden building at the University of Portsmouth.
I'm Ryan Brady. I'm a creative skills tutor for the faculty of CCI and mainly teaching film and TV.
Cool. And you probably saw these session aims on the website as you signed up for it, but just to kind of give you a taster of what you can expect. So we're going to be exploring gamification and the positive impacts it can have in a classroom environment. So obviously I sort of emphasize that positive impact there because in our humble opinion, play and gamification can have a really good presence in sort of a higher education environment. And we'll be discussing ways that gamification is already being implemented here at the University of Portsmouth. And we'll actually be talking to you about a project that we've undertaken that implores some of the gamification into education and what we teach as well. And then we'll explore online gamification possibilities, which is obviously something that's really important at the moment with this blended learning environment that we find ourselves in. So, I mean, some of you may already know what gamification actually is, but just in case you don't, when we talk about gamification, obviously I've got some quotes there because people seem to have different sort of variations of what gamification actually is. But basically, it's just when you apply game design elements or principles of games themselves and game mechanics into something to create your desired outcomes. So in education, obviously, we can use sort of play and game characteristics in our sort of teaching to aid our learning outcomes as part of that. And obviously you can have a gander at those if you want to later. So you have to bear there's some beeping going on then. So obviously we're going to be talking to you about a project that we undertook and looking at how gamification and play can sit in a higher education environment. And of course, we have so many different students and so many that come from so many walks of life and different backgrounds, and they all learn very, very differently. And we've got some quotes here that I find really, really sort of useful and nice because, as it says there, students' diverse histories, cultural backgrounds, racial identities, and personalities being teaching and learning is inevitably complex, then shouldn't our approaches to helping and assessing learning exhibit a similar variety? And of course, that's so true. You know, we expect students to come to us with a certain way of wanting to approach learning and things like that. So obviously, when we're sort of teaching them and assessing their learning, shouldn't we be thinking of different methods that we could aid them in sort of achieving their learning outcomes? You know, based upon some of them may be very theory-based, some of them may learn very practically and by getting hands-on with things. So it's down to us sort of as teachers to be able to explore different ways that we can impart this information to them. So excuse me, I'm very flailing. I probably look really army on here. Sorry if I hit you in the face.
That twice.
Okay.
Okay, so we've taken some extensive research before undertaking our own project, but basically there's a guy called Eric A. Evanson, who's a fellow teacher, and he goes on to explore how he can actually implement a game into his teaching, especially as I think he's a chemistry teacher. So he wanted to make a game aimed at children living with diabetes, and actually he concludes his study with, as media evolves, application of it must also evolve in order to maintain relevance, accessibility and usability. It's great for us because obviously what we're trying to do as teachers is, again, move with the times. And his game was called Balance of Power. Him and 4 other colleagues, I believe, created this game. It was a great success. So these children actually learn a bit better about how to manage their diet, exercise, all that in balance with their condition, and even help their friends and family. So it didn't even go, it went on beyond 7 to 12 demographic that he was aiming for in terms of age. Actually, his parents and everybody else actually understood how to live with the disease better. So yeah, it's a good basis for us because we know someone out there has actually undertaken something like that and actually implemented play really effectively into their teaching. So yeah, that was our first basis of research. And again, we found other people that have tried various methods and incorporating play into everyday teaching, again, across all different levels of study, age groups. And again, it just strengthens our case that play is a really good, effective way of achieving learning objectives into the classroom. So yeah, that's we didn't go too much into it, but we just wanted to make sure that if we were going to go down a similar route, whether or not it's going to be worth exploring. So yeah, it's good to know that people out there actually already tried it. Going to the next part.
Cool. So obviously we'll talk to you a little bit about the project that we undertook based upon this notion that play does have a place in the higher education environment. And obviously I teach across the School of Film, Media, Communication. So I teach on the film production and television and broadcasting courses. And obviously you teach across sort of the CCI faculty as a whole. So there's lots and lots of film students on there. And all of the courses that are incorporated into this school or faculty are very practical and technical. And obviously we'll have students that come to us who aren't necessarily entirely practical in their brain. They may be very theory-based, and because of this, we have to try and adapt some of our teaching to kind of cater for them. So let's say, for instance, we have students who are level 4 students that have come from college and they aren't very technical. They don't deem themselves very technical at all, but they've obviously come and studied a very technical course. Now, they may think for themselves, okay, actually, what I want to do when I study film production is I want to learn how to pick up a camera, go out and shoot images. I don't care about anything else. I don't want to do video editing, for instance, which is where we based our sort of notion of incorporating play. Now, of course, as part of our level 4 teaching, they have to do a core module where we teach them video editing and using a software called Avid Media Composer. Now, if you imagine you're one of those level 4 students who says, I don't want to do editing ever, and you're being forced into a situation to sit at a computer and learn a software that you really, really don't want to know anything about, it can be really, really daunting and really hard to engage in that environment. And a lot of students come to us with this misconception that actually they can't grasp technical teaching at all because that's not in their remit of being able to retain that knowledge. And because of that, it sort of led us to think about ways that we could help them see that actually they can grasp technical skills. Anybody can grasp technical skills as long as you're open to learning it. So we try to sort of think of how we can incorporate play, something very, very simple and something anyone can do, into that environment to aid them in learning those skills that they didn't think were attainable. And obviously our duty as teachers is to come up with innovative ways that we can impart this knowledge to different students. So we decided that we were going to create a video editing board game, and specifically the board game is there to teach software skills. And of course, initially it's like, well, if someone is going to sit at a computer and edit in a piece of software, how on earth could you teach software skills while sitting at a game like Monopoly and learning from it? So we had to think of ways that we could actually impart this information within that play environment. Now, of course, there's loads of different notions of gamification and play. You know, that you could literally use Play-Doh, you could use Lego, for instance, you could use video games or whatever. So why did we specifically choose a board game? And we chose this very carefully, and mainly this was because obviously it's very social and it encourages peer learning. And I do feel that in our workshops, peer learning is such a massive part of the learning experience. And I imagine it's the same for many of you who, regardless of which department you teach in, if students are learning together, then actually more learning occurs. Because, in our video editing workshops, for instance, what will happen is a student will say, oh, what does this button do? And then Mike, who's sat over in the corner, pipes up and he says, oh, well, actually, that does blah, 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 blah. And obviously it gives him a little brush of his ego because he knew how to fix it. But obviously it establishes a memory that other students can then pull from and go, oh, yeah, I'll remember that next time, because they've got something to base that knowledge on. And more importantly, obviously, it disguises that technical aspect of learning the software. So if a student isn't technical, if they're sat in a board game environment playing with other people, obviously for them, they're just getting to the desired goal of winning the game. They're not thinking necessarily about, oh, I'm learning about Avid, which is the editing software. They're more thinking about, I'm going to win this damn game. And because of that disguising of the technical side, hopefully more learning would occur as part of that. And obviously there's less pressure to learn about it as well, because it is just a game. If you lose the game, oh well, I might win next time. Whereas obviously if you have software in front of you and your edit that you're trying to put together has gone all wrong, there's more pressure there because you think, flip, I've got to try and fix that now. So it's trying to incorporate play in a way that actually takes away some of that technical pressure that comes with being sat in that environment that they're not comfortable in necessarily. And then, of course, it encourages more imaginative ideas because, we're coming at the teaching in a different way, which then hopefully will provoke the students to think slightly differently about things and hopefully in turn think more differently about their learning and be more imaginative. And it's fun. I mean, obviously games aren't for everyone. There could be some people sat here thinking, this is my worst nightmare. I wouldn't want to play a board game if my life depended on it. But for a majority, generally speaking, there is a board game out there that could probably sort of cater for most people. So whilst it's not for everyone, so play isn't for everyone, I'm sure there are people that don't want to entertain any aspect of play or gamification, but it's a niche that actually is quite broad. So for a lot of our students and some of the research that we did, board games do seem to cater for quite a few people. So that's another reason why we chose that.
So on the back of that, why a board game? Well, Zachary Horton is an associate professor from the University of Pittsburgh, and he was asked on social media to expand as why board games are suddenly really popular. It wasn't the reason we chose a board game, but it's one of the things, or one of the fundamental reasons it kind of just led us to choose this routine, because we're video gamers really, but board games, is a thing we've all pretty much played. Everyone I've met anyway, most people have actually at least played a board game. So we just thought it was the safest choice. And Zachary Horton goes on to say, the interest in board games, retaliation against the ubiquity of digital media, people are looking for more engaged and social activities as they become more isolated by technology. And of course, people crave that social connection. Now, even prior to the pandemic, people still had this mindset, because I think, since the rise of social media and popularity of Facebook, Instagram, all those sort of platforms, people have become a little bit more isolated. Obviously, what has promoted that is this current climate. So board games are actually, the sales of board games have gone up massively in the past 10 years. And it used to be a bit of a cult thing, especially people my age. I would only know people that would go to pubs with game-themed nights or whatever. I'd hear about Dungeons and Dragon nights, all that type of stuff. And you would think, like, why an adult play a board game? But actually, there is a place for it even today. So it's even more relevant now that we sort of explore that option. And again, yeah, it is just a case of software, how to make it a bit more, for us, a bit more hands-on. And you can't really do that with software. Well, we think we probably could at least help aid the terminology a little bit, but it just kind of using research like this, it just helps us know, again, steering us in the right direction, and reinforces the fact that what we made isn't going to be well received.
Cool. So obviously we're talking specifically about something we've done, which is a board game, but everything that we speak about now can be implemented regardless of what aspect of play you might think about implementing into your teaching. So once we decided that we wanted to create a board game, we then had to consider, how do we actually go about it? What do we have to put into the board game to make learning occur? So because of that, what we had to decide was, okay, so people come in, they play the game, what do they get out of it? What skills do we want them to walk away from that table within their brains? So what we did was think about that, and we broke it down into 3 specific learning outcomes. So we wanted the game to introduce the interface of the actual software itself. So we built familiarity between the board game itself, which we'll show you in a jiffy, and the actual software interface. We wanted them, or students that play it, to understand the purpose of the software, and most importantly, have a positive engagement with it. As I said earlier, some students would not have any positive things to say about Avid at all, just because they're not technically, or they don't feel technically literate, or as Ryan said, they could have used other softwares and compare the two and think, yeah, this Avid business isn't for me. So the board game also needs to create some positivity into the software, so that when they're actually using it, they're not just bogged down with the fact that they hate it, etc. And then most importantly, obviously we want them to learn button functions and keystrokes as well. So what will happen if they press this particular button in the software? What will become of that? What will be the result if they hit that button? So these were the 3 main components that we decided. And then what we could do was work backwards from there to figure out how we would get them to learn those learning outcomes. It's very similar. So I imagine many of you have made modules or designed courses here at the university. So it works in a very similar way to that. It's just the same process. You decide your learning outcomes, you work backwards from there so that you know the content is going to result in those learning outcomes. And the other thing is obviously Avid, or any software, if any of you have used software before, have layers of complexity. So you have that basic level that people start with, and then as time goes on, you become more competent, etc. And because of this, we had to make sure every bit of information we're putting into this form of play or gamification is obviously relevant to our target audience. And in this instance, it's beginners of Avid. So for the curriculum, it's level 4 beginners. And for a broader aspect, it's anyone who just wants to learn Avid effectively, or learn the editing software that we're talking about. So because of this, obviously the information has to be really, really relevant to that demographic. And we learned something quite sort of useful in this process, and I didn't know about it before. I didn't know it had a word anyway. It was called the seductive details effect. And basically, this is when you come up with sort of, say, your lesson plan that you're going to do, and you embellish it with certain interesting aspects that aren't necessarily relevant to your learning outcomes, but they help make it more interesting and sell it to your students, which is great. But obviously, if you add in too much content that isn't necessary to the learning outcomes, then it can have a detrimental effect. And because you're almost just covering and masking all of the information that you really want them to retain with all of this other information. And that's basically what the seductive details effect is. So we had to make sure we weren't putting in too many little golden eggs, if you like, that masked everything that we were trying to get the outcomes from. and just ensure that everything that was in the board game was going to ensure the learning outcomes were met at the end of it. So as it says there, students are exactly like us. They can only retain so much information. Therefore, what we do put in, we have to make it count. And obviously that's exactly the same for anything that you're teaching, whether it just be a regular session. But for our play aspects, it was just as important for the board game.
Okay, so you can tell we've watched Art Attack. So basically, there are these colours. So we'll go into the colour schemes very quickly. They aren't random. They do actually correlate with Avid software itself. Come and get us, Avid, if you think we've breached copyright. But it's just again to reinforce the information to students of well, it's to give them a bit of familiarity. When they go to Avid, they're not going to be shocked about maybe where to find it. It's a bit of an extra navigation reinforcement. So the reds or anything darker implement or implies something destructive with the program, and yellow and lighter is something non-destructive. Again, I won't go too much into it. It's something technical and it is pretty much bound to Avid, but it's just another subtle golden egg, as Becky's already mentioned, that the students will then later on realise when it comes to Avid and why they're even like that. So they aren't random. They do correlate with Avid specifically. The actual style of the buttons, again, cartoony replications of what Avid actually have. Again, a copyright issue would probably foresee, but these are, again, this is just a prototype. If we do need to change it, we can. The console cards they're similar to the chance cards in Monopoly. So depending on what the player picks up can have a negative or positive impact on their gameplay. It could be something that makes them miss a turn or something that actually gives them extra life or whatever. The story card is basically what they need to use to win the game, and that goes on to this thing here, which is basically a real-life version of the timeline in Avid. Means nothing to a lot of you, I imagine, but these little slots where the story cards will end up. Some of them quite humorous, which again aids the fun aspect. And the music cards are essentially lifelines. Again, we've got a video that will show all this, but it's just to give you an overhaul as why we designed it like this. And the link import and export is effectively start. So they will start on that tab and they'll work their way around the board. But yeah, design choices aren't completely random. They do correlate with the software, just our own take on it, so to speak.
Cool. So we've got, as Ryan said, we've got a video that sort of breaks down it further. And I mean, some of the points that were just mentioned will be repeated slightly, but it basically, the main thing is that everything that's on this board incorporates itself into the software. So we are building that familiarity across everything, so that the students, obviously, if they are then sat in front of the software and they remember that when in the board game they landed on that lift card that you can see here, then of course the same action will happen as it did in the actual board game itself. And I understand that for some of you it's like, well, I'm never going to learn anything about video editing, but the video itself will just sort of explain how we came about making these deciding factors, that maybe if you guys then think, how could I incorporate play in my teaching, you can kind of see all the processes that we had to make to correlate this information into something that was useful. I don't know if I'm missing like chat things here.
There are a few comments in the chat. We can either pick them up as we're going through or at the end.
Yeah, let's do that. I was a worry I'll just go off on a tangent.
We'll leave some time at the end.
Cool, awesome. So basically a synopsis of the game that we've created is all students have to do is they will become familiar with the software functions based on what squares they land on. And at the end, they should have creatively constructed an edit. So I would just try and play this video for you, which just gives you an overview of what we've created. Forgive the cardboard nature of the game. It is just a prototype, but just to give you a basis of what we've done here. And obviously you won't know Avid necessarily, so it might seem a little bit like, what the hell's going on.
The game is designed to be played by 2 to 4 people, however it could also be played solo. Players begin the game with 8 numbered story cards, a music card, a title card, and a credits card. Players will take the cards from the dock and place these cards into their bin. The concept of the game is to create a picture-locked edit consisting of these cards in the correct order. Players have what's called a timeline rack each, which replicates the timeline panel inside of Avid. A dice is rolled in order to decide who goes first. The highest number wins. Players decide on a coffee mug counter and begin playing the game. The square dice is rolled first, and this represents movement on the board. If players land on a square that requires the position indicator in their timeline rack to be moved, then they will roll the second dice to determine how many times to move that along the timeline. This is designed to behave in a similar way to the timeline in Avid. Depending on where the position indicator ends up in their timeline rack is where their chosen story card is placed or removed. When beginning the game, players cannot place any of their cards into the timeline rack until they have first passed the transcode square. This runs parallel with the editing workflows we teach them, as they do not edit with their media until they have first transcoded it. Of course, this terminology may not be familiar with students, so at the bottom of the rules we have a little key that mentions what these words mean. The squares on the game behave differently and replicate what would happen in the software. Let's say I'm playing and I land on a splice sim. I could first refer to my icon key, which tells me whether or not I need to throw the second dice. In this instance, I do, and I then need to move my position indicator up as many times as the dice dictates. I then need to perform a splice sim. As you can see on the icon key, splice sim will place my chosen story card wherever the position indicator is and move all other neighbouring cards up. If I land on an overwrite, it will simply overwrite the story card that is there. Because I'm overwriting the card, the overwritten card must then be returned to the card dock. Splice and an overwrite all place cards into your timeline. The lift and extract, as I will talk about now, remove story cards from your timeline. If I land on a lift, I roll my position indicator dice, move it along my timeline rack, and then literally lift it out of the timeline, leaving a gap. If I land on the extract, something different happens. If I remove it, any clips or story cards after it move back to close the gap. The other 2 function squares are called segment modes. These do not require the use of the second dice, as they manipulate anything that is already on the timeline rack. These are also optional, so you do not have to use them if you don't want to. So why are they useful? Well, if you land on a splice in segment tool and any of your cards happen to be in the wrong order, you can use the splice in segment to move a story card into the correct order. An overwrite segment square is great if you have any cards you want to move onto empty filler, as the rest of the timeline remains unaffected. The console squares work similar to the chance cards you would see in Monopoly. When you land on them, you must pick up a console card and address what's written. Part of the game is to encourage students to think about the stories that they're creating. Therefore, they may decide that one of their numbered cards doesn't really match the rest. For this reason, every time a player passes the link or import square, they may pick up a new card and place it into their bin. Much like the starting cards though, this cannot be placed into the timeline until they have first passed the transcode square. Picking up cards is also useful if you're missing any numbered cards thanks to the overwrite square in the game. Once you have managed to get everything on the timeline, the player must then declare picture lock, which protects them from any subsequent square they land on. They must then race to the export square to export or render their edit, and they have won the game.
Cool. Sorry if you heard like some kind of car thing going on outside. I tried to mute it and it just paused the entire video. So that's why that went a bit funky there. So basically that obviously just shows you how we tried to correlate the teaching of the software in with the board game that we've created. You know, as you can see, it's still quite a prototype. You know, those coffee mugs weren't perfect, but I'm sure we'll get some nice ones done eventually.
So, yeah, we actually got around to doing some limited testing of the game. Obviously, the original idea was to actually have a set of 2 focus groups, one aimed at our demographic, which was the students, so 18 to 21 or even mature than that, level 4s. Unfortunately, we couldn't do that due to the pandemic, and we would have had another focus group aimed for fellow lecturers that actually teach this sort of software. That way we can adapt anything further of the game, any technical issues or anything that we've just missed. Confident we haven't, but you just never know. And that was the aim for that focus group. Unfortunately, couldn't do any of that. What we could do in the meantime was to actually test this out on another member of staff that we are good friends with. Luckily for us, in a way as well, he has no prior knowledge of this software at all. He's interested in film, but he doesn't really go into any technical aspects like editing or anything. And we actually did a little testing play of that between Becky and himself. And yeah, 2 hours later, someone, I think you won, didn't you? But some positive feedback came out of it. Out of 10 questions, so there were some technical questions that we asked in there, whether or not he could recite back, if we gave him like a scenario, what does splicing do? What does this segment mode result in if you move this along the timeline? He actually answered 9 out of 10. For someone who has never actually touched the software before, and you know, we weren't expecting much, but actually it showed that even someone without that prior knowledge would never used anything similar. It just goes to show that the game does have educational merit. So we're quite pleased with that result, even on this basis that it's just cardboard. But I think the story cards made it because of how humorous they are. And I think the objectives were just very clear. And he just knew the rules after about an hour and a half in, didn't he?
He was also very, very competitive. So I think that really helped, because it obviously, if you have competitive people playing a game, I'm competitive, he was competitive. So it aided the learning experience, because you almost want to learn the rules quickly because you want to win the damn game. So it's one of those things where you build this environment that, again, people don't know they're necessarily learning. They're just learning the rules of a game as well.
Yeah, so it was interesting for us. And actually, in some ways, it gave us more than what we expected. So we're quite confident if we did manage to get around testing this outside this pandemic in a better scenario where we can test it on students and other staff alike, we could perfect it to its full potential. So 2 areas of focusing on, so curriculum teaching and support teaching.
Yeah, so we're obviously the game's intended for those two aspects, so curriculum and support. So I'll just talk a bit about the curriculum, because that's where I'm mostly embedded. So we've designed it, obviously from the very beginning, to work alongside the current curriculum that we have. So our video editing module across the two courses, film production and television and broadcasting. And obviously we work very, very closely with the module coordinator, Neil. I think he might be here somewhere having a little nosy, but he actually helped create the game as well and aided in the testing of it, so that we could ensure that everything we were putting into the game was really, really current, and could run concurrently with the level 4 curriculum as well. And obviously, as Ryan has said, we haven't managed to test the game as much as we would have liked because of everything, but hopefully in the next sort of beginning of the year, for our new level 4 cohort, we're hoping to pop it into a classroom environment and just see what happens, really. So currently the format of the module is we have one weekly 2-hour practical software workshop with each student. And the idea is that maybe that one of these could be replaced, rather than them coming in, sitting at a computer and learning the software, they could come in, be presented with a series of board games that they then play with their peers, which obviously is something a bit different. They wouldn't be expecting it. It takes them out of that sort of generic state that you can get in when it comes to workshop and things like that. And hopefully they'd see the benefit of it. And in turn with that, if we can create as many of them as we, quite a few of them, we could then have a sort of booking system, kind of like a library book. And obviously students could take it home, meet with their peers and play the game and revise at home as well. So it's another tool, sort of a revision tool and a teaching aid that can be used alongside that curriculum.
So for myself, I've sort of gone at this from a different route as well. I teach on the curriculum, but I don't have any sort of influence over any sort of decisions made or anything like that. So I support students who are undertaking the curriculum, but not strictly. So for me personally, where I teach from sort of level 4, even foundation students through to masters, it'd be quite interesting, I think, for some of them to engage with this game as well, because they could be coming from different courses that just might prove they want an interest in editing, or just Avid overall. Maybe they've never touched Avid before, but their course restricts them from using it. Well, not restricts them, but there's no reason for them to use it. So they might come to me and ask for some sessions on that. So this could be a really good instrument to use for those students as well. And also master students, which come from all different types of backgrounds, come from even other universities. They might have never even done a course on editing or anything to do with film. So actually, if they do, and I have done, you know, there's quite a few master students that have come to me and learn Avid that level. So again, they're at the same level as a level 4 in terms of they're very new to it, and this again could prove useful for them. So yeah, I can see it going in a different angle. I do not think it's limited to sort of level 4 cohort. I can see how it fits in, but I can see how it fits in even broader. So it's great for that aspect too. And it does have, you know, the design choices and technical choices have both those considerations in place. So yeah, it's great for my role. And so this is only a recent thing we've talked about, because naively we thought that the lockdown would probably stop around September, maybe even the 2 weeks they thought it would actually only last for. So we didn't really consider the online aspect, but we have sort of looked at other board games that have been replicated online. So Monopoly's already been online, it's been online for years. So Facebook, I think, have an app for it, and other things like Scrabble. So there is potential for this to take online. So we thought about maybe making the board something central where everyone can sort of come into sort of a room online, and they'd see the board with the rest of their peers, and then each player would have a virtual version of this thing, either on their phone or on their desktop, and essentially, you know, they'll be building a story at home, but using the board as a centerpiece between their cohort. So that's just in, you know, we're exploring that option. And yeah, when it comes to, you know, it just seems more important now that we explore that option, because this could go on for a while. But yeah, so in terms of actually learning, for the meantime, we think we can actually loan this out to students if they are stuck in halls or stuck at home or whatever. And there's nothing to say we can't just distribute this out, or they can come and get it from the university direct and play this either online with other students as a board game, and just film themselves playing it. I know people play chess like that. So yeah, there's loads of options out there for us to explore in the future for the online potential.
And obviously, pandemic aside, it's still something that's really, really valuable, regardless of the fact that we have to put a lot of our teaching online anyway. Because obviously, alongside the curriculum, if you imagine students coming in and having face-to-face workshops, then it gives them something else to sort of practice outside of that. So they don't have to physically come in and get a game. They could be at home a bit bored and think, why not just fire up my Avid game? Possibly, maybe said no one ever, but maybe they might. Yeah, you know, they could fire up the Avid game and just do a bit of revision in like a fun way. You know, I imagine there'd be some students that would be quite down with that. And so even you can have that blended learning approach where we have the online version, but then obviously inside of the workshops, they're implementing the knowledge that they've learned from the online game into their face-to-face workshops. And I think one massive thing for me, or for both of us, that is obviously the social aspect of it. It's not just about the technical things that they learn from it. It's creating that sense of community. And with the film production course in particular, a lot of our feedback is based around students who don't necessarily feel a part of something or feel a sense of community. And a lot of this is just down to numbers. You know, we have massive numbers on the film production course. So, you know, if you've got over 100 students in 1 year, they're not going to know each other, like all of them. And because of that, we have to think of ways and innovative ways we can try and make that happen and build that sense of community. So actually, something like this, again, pushes them together to sort of build that setup as well. And obviously, we've just sort of gone over one particular example of how we looked at play. And just to say, you know, this idea all stemmed from another session in play. So we were sat in a session that we had, and someone was doing a talk on sort of implementing play in teaching, and they had us sort of using Play-Doh to create certain things, and just sort of opening our minds to the fact that play and gamification has a place in education. And from that, conversation started on, wonder what, you know, we could do in our courses. And this is where all of this stemmed from. So obviously this is just a tiny example of what could be done. And for you guys, I imagine, depending on which department you've come from, there would be something that you could implement play-wise into your departments as well. That might be quite fun, not just for your students, but also yourselves. I know we've had fun playing this.
Yeah, and just on the back of that, you know, when we first thought of it, initially, when we were asked to think about how we can incorporate play into our sessions, we looked at each other like, well, what we teach is already fun. You know, cameras, editing, why wouldn't anyone find that fun? But then taking ourselves out of that, we realised that there are students who look at the software or look at what they are learning and they think, wow, this is too technical, there's no way. So going, you know, sort of putting ourselves in their shoes, what could they do differently? Or how could they learn that particular software differently to what we were already used to? Because, you know, we grew up when computers were fun. So anything put on a computer screen was fun. So why would a board game be any different? But actually doing this, or when we come up with the idea, it was just an interesting way of how to bridge that gap. So yeah, we've learned a lot just doing it. So yeah, it's definitely opened our minds.
Cool. So I mean, that's pretty much all we have to say on that. I mean, obviously there's some chat comments that we'll have a gander at now as well. But obviously we'd be really interested in knowing if any of you guys have sort of already implemented gamification or play in your subject areas, or even if there's anything that you might have ideas on doing as well. If there is anything, as sort of a discussion, and we will check out. Obviously, and if there's any more questions, fire them away. We're really far away from that. I need to get closer.
Shall I read some questions to you from the chat?
Yeah.
Although not much in the way of questions, most just compliments. I think everyone really likes the approach, and I'm not surprised because obviously I've seen it before and it looks fantastic. But I think you've got across the message quite well that obviously you're talking about a very complex piece of software that you need to get people to work. So the game is quite complicated, and I imagine a lot of work went into it. But I think it's quite clear that there's lots of principles that underpin this that could apply in quite simple contexts. You can play quite simple games in this. And I think, well, Richard, you've asked a couple questions about transferring this. Do you want to just unmute and have at it yourself?
Yes, if I can. I mean, I think you've answered the question I was asking. I was kind of thinking of, I teach law. So, and one of my teaching subjects is land law, which is one of those subjects, there must be equivalence in every discipline, that a few people love. And I'm not sure I can say that every student quite shares my love of land law. It's highly technical. So I was thinking, looking at this, that here you've got a piece of software that looks as though it's highly technical, that once you understand it, it makes sense. But until then, it could be an amazing array of, what do I do? Do I do this now? Or do I do that now? Why? How do I decide which? Sometimes it should be this next. Sometimes it should be that next, and so on. And there's a fair amount of what we do in law that's true of, that it's highly technical at first glance. When you understand it, then it will make sense. But it won't make sense until you understand all. It's kind of saying you won't understand any of land law until you first understand all of it. And the paradox is kind of deliberate. But I was thinking there are probably ways that can be this idea of turning it into a game, which to some extent we do in law anyway, with sort of moots and mock trials. But this is the idea of doing it in board game form is fascinating. I know people have done law computer games, but the idea of doing it as a board game, as you were in effect saying, is intriguingly retro. I think that's a fabulous idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I could see it like, in all subject areas like that. I think if you've got something that's really seems very technical, and until you understand it, it doesn't make sense, something like this is really good at breaking down those barriers. So, I think it would be beneficial in sort of a subject area like that. That's cool.
Hello, it's Ben Hodgson. I know I'm in the field department. Hello there. That's all interesting. I love the game. I could dread to think the hours spent constructing that board game, but put one in my stocking. Give me some. But I've although I don't play any video games myself at all, I'm aware that students do, and some of you might be aware of this Cine Tracer software that's available, which is Unreal Engine software based, which is a sort of gaming program, which I'm not into, but I know it speaks to some people involved. And there's a capability there to for film students to utilize equipment that we can't afford to have, or we don't have time to get out in workshops and in the university. So particularly lighting and camera equipment, which has been developed in this sort of faux game scenario. But it means that if I was able to roll it out, I could start instructing and encouraging the students to learn how to use film-related equipment in a different environment. In other words, a game environment, where they may not be playing a game, but it would feel like they were playing a game. And I need to learn how to use it as well. I'm not a gamer, but the idea is sort of got traction, but it's just being blocked by the university at the moment. But I'm hoping to get it through. But I'm certainly interested in the whole concept of trying to teach it in that way, which seems, as you say, more sort of accessible and pertinent to the student's own sort of life environment.
Yeah. Well, I think as well, like if I put myself in the student's shoes and say with yourself, you're teaching 3-point lighting or something, then if someone said to me, 3-point lighting, I might switch off a little bit. But if someone said, okay, now 3-point light this video game scene, I'm down with that. It's one of those things where I think you almost make it more appealing, don't you, by making it gamey. And maybe that's, speak for just us nerds, but something like that is something that I would be down with. And I know so many students would as well, because it is a new approach of looking at things like that. And I know you've mentioned this before, and I think it's such a good idea. Just hopefully the university allows it to happen. I don't know if you're talking, Ben. If you are. Ben.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I mean, I certainly like the way that if you're playing your game, you don't have to start pressing buttons and trying to work out how the software works in order to get the concept. And similarly with this video-based thing, it's you don't have to worry about the bloody lighting cables, what the ampage is, where the stands are, where the gels are. It's sort of immediate gratification, if you like, and that's what and that's the learning process. They just get immediate gratification rather than delayed. And later on, they've got to work out how to use the software and how to put the gels up and stuff. But I think that's another sort of appealing aspect to it, because it saves so much time. And we know, delivering stuff, it just takes a long time really to deliver a lot of what we have to teach in detail. And it just removes a whole load of hours of kind of sort of semi-irrelevant delivery.
Yeah. I mean, for myself, I find that even now in my role, that I'm getting students second year, third year film, TVB, that are learning. They're just learning the basics now in terms of the language. They'll know how to use the tools roughly, but they get to third year and they go, do you know what? I didn't even know what splicing actually did. I just dragged and dropped it, or I just did this and I just did that. So learning this soon on, this is, one of the main reasons we did it like this was we wanted to get the language understood and just some of the basic concept, because later on they can learn all that complex stuff. And I just found that a lot of them were getting a lot of things lost, even in their second and third year, because they were just skimming through and just getting the basics understood, in terms of making it look good enough that lecturers can go, yeah, you clearly understand it. But I was still getting second year, I mean, imagine you do as well, second year, third year students, which should have learnt it in first year, just didn't really take it on because they just looked like they knew what they were doing. But actually they regret it soon after, because not understanding why that something does that, you know, it would make them sloppy editors. So yeah, I completely get starting with the basics of a language like this is a really fundamental way of getting it taught.
And just taking out, you know, like, this isn't going to crash. The
Yeah.
software is, you know, we're not going to
Burn
suddenly
it.
have error messages popping up on the board game like you were getting Avid. Just like with lighting, cable managing and stuff like that, although important, is tedious to do it every single time you're having to set up a lighting setup and things like that. So yeah, this sort of stuff takes all of that away. And as Richard has said there, you know, the mistakes are a lot less disastrous. So people can practice without making the mistakes that could be the difference between someone getting squashed by a light, for instance, in your case, Ben, and you know, or in the software itself. I know students who are scared to press buttons because they think it's going to ruin my whole entire edit, everything's going to go and my computer's going to blow up. So doing it on a board game capacity, you don't mind getting it wrong, because the detrimental effect isn't going to be very high, because obviously all that's going to happen is your board, one of your cards is going to be lost. Whereas actually in your editing in the software, you are affecting something physical. So obviously it does take that danger away.